From the Maroons in Suriname to Tula's Uprising in Curacao, the history of the Dutch Caribbean is filled with heroes that looked for the first opportunities to break free from their shackles and taste freedom again. Here we tell this often overlooked Caribbean history and explore the foods that they gave us. While the British Caribbean and Haiti usually get most of the attention when we talk about resistance of enslaved communities in the Caribbean, the smaller French islands and the Dutch Caribbean deserve to be recognized for their efforts. In fact, one of the most important rebellions in the Dutch Caribbean, Tula's Uprising, which was also made into a movie, was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which demonstrates just how connected the Caribbean diaspora is. Welcome to Heritage Food Stories, Season 2, Episode 10, Stories of Resistance in the Dutch Caribbean. I'm your host, Chef Mireille, culinary historian, food educator, and cultural storyteller with a lifelong passion for exploring global cuisines and the stories behind the food we eat. I preserve history, connect cultures, and inspire curiosity through food. Every dish tells a story, and it's my privilege to tell it. Quick reminder before we dive in, this is a history podcast and a food podcast. I want you to use it like one. Every episode comes with recipes linked in the description. Here's my challenge to you. Cook one of them with your kids. Not next Tuesday, right now, whenever you're listening. Let the food be the lesson, because I promise you, a child who learns about Caribbean history while frying fish cakes or making a pot of curry is going to remember it a lot longer than anything they read in a textbook. Recipes are in the caption. Tag me at Chef Mireille whenever you make something. I genuinely want to see it. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join in the conversation in the comments. It helps more people find this important history that deserves to be retold. Before we dive into today's topic, don't forget to check out the previous episode on resistance in the British Caribbean, as well as the episode we did on Thico and the Maroons of Suriname, where we explored how escaped enslaved Africans built independent communities deep within Suriname's rainforest and eventually forced the Dutch to recognize their freedom through a series of peace treaties. Those maroon communities remain one of the most remarkable examples of resistance anywhere in the Americas. Their story deserved its own space, and we've already explored it in detail. Today, we're turning our attention to the other men and women whose courage shaped the history of the Dutch Caribbean, from Suriname to Curacao, Aruba, Bonaire, Sint Maarten, Saba, and Sint Eustatius. Together, these stories remind us that resistance in the Dutch Caribbean was never limited to one colony or one famous rebellion. Every island has its own history, and every community found its own way to challenge slavery. Although several Maroon communities negotiated peace treaties with the Dutch during the 18th century, as we discussed in the episode on Suriname, not everyone believed peace was the answer. One of the best known leaders to reject that path was Boni. Much of Boni's early life remains uncertain, but historians believe he was born into slavery around the middle of the 18th century. His father is thought to have been a Dutch plantation owner, while his mother was an enslaved African woman. Like every other child born into slavery, his future had already been decided before he had any say in it. Instead of accepting that future, Boni escaped into Suriname's interior, where he eventually became the leader of a Maroon community that would later become known as the Aluku, or Boni's people. Unlike the Njuka and the Saramaka, the Aluku never signed a lasting peace treaty with the Dutch during Boni's lifetime. While other Maroon groups had negotiated for their freedom, Boni believed the struggle against slavery was far from over. Hidden deep within the rainforest at Fort Boko, Boni and his followers launched carefully planned raids on plantations along the coast. They seized food, weapons, and supplies, but their goal extended far beyond survival. They also freed enslaved people, inviting them to join the maroon communities and weakening the plantation system with every successful raid. Every attack reminded plantation owners that despite the treaties, they still did not have complete control of Suriname. The Dutch viewed Boni as one of the greatest threats that they had ever faced in the colony. For years, they organized military expeditions to locate Fort Boko and destroy the Aluku settlement. The rainforest, however, continued to work in Boni's favor. His followers knew the rivers and forest trails intimately, allowing them to strike quickly before disappearing into the interior long before colonial troops could respond. His followers knew the rivers and forest trails intimately, allowing them to strike quickly before disappearing into the interior long before colonial troops could respond. As the conflict dragged on, the Dutch became increasingly desperate. They recruited European mercenaries and even relied on some maroon communities that had already signed peace treaties to help fight against Boni's forces. It is one of those moments in history that reminds us that resistance was rarely straightforward. Communities that had once shared a common struggle sometimes made very different decisions about how to protect their people. One of the soldiers sent to Suriname during these campaigns was John Gabriel Stedman, a Scottish-born officer serving in the Dutch military. Although his mission was to suppress the Maroons, his years in Suriname exposed him to the brutality of plantation slavery. He carefully documented what he witnessed, describing not only the military campaigns, but also the violence inflicted on enslaved Africans. His memoir, Narrative of a 5 Years Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname, became one of the most important first-hand accounts of slavery in the Dutch colonies. It offered European readers a rare glimpse into the realities of plantation life and later became an important source for abolitionists campaigning against slavery. Boni was eventually killed in 1793, but his death did not bring an end to the Aluku. The community survived, preserving its traditions, language, and identity long after the fighting ended. Today, the Aluku remain one of Suriname's recognized maroon peoples, demonstrating that resistance was not measured only by victories in battle. Sometimes, survival itself became the greatest act of resistance. While Boni's followers were fighting in Suriname's rainforest, another Dutch colony was experiencing a very different kind of rebellion. This time, the goal was not simply to escape slavery, but to establish a new society governed by formerly enslaved people. In 1763, the Dutch colony of Berbice, located in what is now Guyana, became the site of one of the largest slave uprisings in the Americas. Although Berbice is part of present-day Guyana, it was a Dutch colony at the time, and its history is closely connected to the wider story of Dutch resistance in the Caribbean. Conditions on the plantations had become increasingly desperate. Enslaved Africans endured exhausting labor, disease, food shortages, and brutal punishment, while many plantation owners were struggling financially. As conditions worsened, so did tensions throughout the colony. The uprising began in February 1763 and spread rapidly from plantation to plantation. Within weeks, large parts of Berbice were under the control of the rebels, leaving Dutch officials struggling to respond. Leading the movement was Coffij, also known as Coffij, who is remembered today as a national hero in Guyana. Unlike many rebellions that focused solely on escaping slavery, Coffij envisioned something much larger, As the rebels gained control of the colony, he established a leadership structure and sought to create order within the territory they controlled. Rather than simply overthrowing Dutch authority, he imagined building a new society led by people who once had been enslaved. One of the most remarkable moments of the rebellion came when Coffij proposed dividing the colony in two. He suggested that the Dutch retain control of the northern plantations while the formerly enslaved population governed the southern half of Berbice independently. It was an extraordinary proposal, especially considering the time in which it was made. Coffij wasn't only demanding freedom, he was presenting a political vision for how formerly enslaved people could govern themselves. The Dutch rejected the proposal and instead requested military assistance from neighboring colonies. Reinforcements eventually arrived, helping colonial forces regain control after more than a year of fighting. The consequences were severe. Many rebels were killed during the conflict, while others were publicly executed after the colony was recaptured. Coffij himself died before the rebellion officially ended, although historians continue to debate the exact circumstances of his death. Despite its defeat, the Berbice Revolt left a lasting legacy. It demonstrated that enslaved people were capable not only of resisting oppression, but also of imagining and organizing an entirely different society. Those ideas would continue to influence resistance movements throughout the Caribbean for decades to come. Just over 30 years later, another leader would challenge Dutch authority. This time on the island of Curacao, his name was Tula, and his rebellion remains one of the defining moments in the history of the Dutch Caribbean. By the time Tula led the largest slave uprising in Curacao in 1795, resistance to slavery had already spread across the Caribbean. News traveled between islands through sailors, merchants, free people of color, and enslaved Africans. Although communication was slow, ideas about freedom moved surprisingly quickly. The Haitian Revolution had begun just a few years earlier, proving that enslaved people could challenge European rule. The French Revolution had also introduced new ideas about liberty and equality. Those ideas did not remain in Europe. They reached the Caribbean, where many enslaved people began asking why those principles did not apply to them. It was in this climate that Tula emerged as one of the most important resistance leaders in Dutch Caribbean history. Tula was enslaved on the Canip plantation on the western side of Curacao. At the time, Curacao was under French rule, and with news of the Haitian Revolution, Tula was inspired to act. On August 17, 1795, he and dozens of other enslaved men refused to continue working. Instead of quietly escaping, they confronted their enslavers and demanded their freedom, arguing that if slavery had been challenged elsewhere in the Caribbean, there was no reason it should continue in Curacao. As Tula and his followers traveled across the island, more enslaved people joined them. Within days, the uprising had grown into a movement of nearly 2,000 people, making it the largest slave revolt in Curaçao's history. One of the reasons Tula's rebellion remains so significant is that it was built on reason as much as resistance. Historical accounts describe him questioning why liberty and equality should apply to Europeans, but not to the people forced to labor on the island's plantations. His challenge was directed not only at the plantation owners, but at the contradictions of the colonial system itself. The colonial government responded with force. Dutch troops were sent to suppress the uprising, and after several weeks, Tula was captured. He was tortured, interrogated, and publicly executed in an attempt to discourage future resistance. Colonial authorities hoped that making an example of him, they could restore order on the island. Instead, Tula became one of Curaçao's most enduring national heroes. His story continued to inspire generations long after his death. In 2010, Tula was officially recognized as Curaçao's national hero. And in 2023, the Dutch government formally honored him, acknowledging that his struggle for freedom had been justified. Every year on August 17th, Curaçao commemorates Dia de Lucha para Libertad, the Day of the Freedom Struggle, in his honor. Although the uprising was ultimately suppressed, it had lasting consequences. Plantation owners became increasingly aware that maintaining slavery through fear alone was becoming more difficult. Across the Caribbean, similar revolts were challenging the stability of colonial rule, and Curaçao was no exception. Tula's rebellion may be the best known story of resistance in the Dutch Caribbean, but it was far from the only one. Across the region, resistance took many different forms. Some people organized protests against against brutal working conditions. Others escaped by sea or openly refused to obey colonial authority. Even on islands where geography made escape nearly impossible, enslaved people continued to challenge the system in whatever ways they could. Not every act of resistance became a large-scale rebellion. On many of the smaller Dutch Caribbean islands, people challenged slavery in quieter but equally courageous ways. Their stories may not be as widely known as those of Boni or Tula, but they are no less important. On Aruba, one of the earliest recorded resistance figures was Thico, an enslaved man owned by the Dutch government. In 1795, the same year as Tula's uprising, Thico openly declared that he would no longer accept slavery and demanded his freedom. He was arrested and sent to Curaçao, where he was forced to work at Fort Amsterdam. Although his protest did not lead to immediate emancipation, he is remembered today as one of Aruba's earliest freedom fighters. On Bonaire, resistance was shaped by the island's harsh environment. With few places to escape, many enslaved people were forced to work in the salt pans under extreme conditions. In 1834, Martis de Katalina Janga led an uprising demanding better treatment and an end to the brutal conditions workers endured every day. Although the protest lasted only about a week before being suppressed, it remains one of the defining moments in Bonaire's history. St. Maarten remembers the story of One-Tété Lohkay, an enslaved woman who attempted to escape multiple times despite the severe punishments she faced after each capture. According to local lore, one of her breasts was amputated as punishment, giving rise to the name by which she is remembered today. Despite this horrific abuse, she continued to resist and has become a lasting symbol of courage and determination on the island. Even the small island of Saba has its own remarkable history of resistance. In 1654, 14 enslaved people seized the vessel and attempted to sail to Puerto Rico in search of freedom. Although they were ultimately captured and enslaved again, their story illustrates the extraordinary risks people were willing to take for even the possibility of living freely. Meanwhile, Sint Eustatius, often called the Golden Rock, occupied a unique place in the Dutch Caribbean. As one of the busiest free ports in the 18th century, thousands of enslaved Africans passed through the island before being sold to plantations elsewhere in the Americas. Despite its importance as a trading center, resistance remained a constant part of life there. In 1848, enslaved people on St. Eustatius organized a protest demanding freedom, better food, and improved working conditions. When colonial officials refused their demands, the protest escalated into an uprising. Several participants were killed or wounded when militia forces opened fire, while 6 of the movement's leaders were exiled from the island. Even though the protest was suppressed, it demonstrated that resistance continued throughout the Dutch Caribbean until the very end of slavery. Across these islands, resistance looked different because circumstances were different. Some people fought with weapons, others protested, escaped, or simply refused to accept the lives colonial authorities expected them to live. Together, their stories remind us that the struggle for freedom was never confined to one island or one famous leader. By the time slavery was officially abolished in the Dutch colonies in 1863, resistance had been part of Dutch Caribbean history for more than 2 centuries. Some people fought openly, others escaped into the rainforest, and many resisted in quieter ways that rarely appeared in colonial records. Together, their actions challenged the system that depended on complete control. For many years, however, these stories were largely told from the perspective of colonial officials. History books focused on governors, merchants, and plantation owners, while the people who fought against slavery often received only passing mention. That began to change in the 20th century. One of the most important figures in reclaiming this history was Anton de Kom, a Surinamese writer, activist, and anti-colonial thinker. Born in 1898, he was the son of a man who had been born into slavery and emancipated as an infant in 1863, the same year slavery was abolished in Suriname. Although de Kom belonged to a new generation, the legacy of slavery shaped both his life and his work. In 1934, he published We Slaves of Suriname, the first major history of Dutch colonial rule, written from the perspective of the people who had endured it rather than those who had governed it. Instead of celebrating colonial expansion, de Kom focused on the violence of slavery, the resilience of the maroon communities, and the countless acts of resistance that had been overlooked for generations. The book challenged the way Dutch colonial history had traditionally been told. Rather than presenting enslaved people as passive victims waiting to be liberated, de Kom showed that they had resisted from the very beginning, whether through escape, rebellion, or the preservation of their cultures. They had continuously challenged the system that sought to oppress them. Although the book was controversial when it was first published, it has since become one of the most influential works on Suriname's history. Today, it continues to inspire historians, educators, and readers throughout the Caribbean and the Netherlands, ensuring that these stories are not forgotten. The history of resistance in the Dutch Caribbean cannot be told through a single rebellion or a single leader. It is the story of the Maroons who built independent communities in Suriname's rainforest, of Boni and the Aluku who continued the fight when others chose peace, of Coffij's vision for an independent Berbice, and of Tula's demand that the ideals of liberty should apply to everyone. It is also the story of Thico, Martis, Katalina, Janga, One-Tété, Lohkay, and the many men and women whose names have not always appeared in history books, but whose courage shaped the islands they called home. One reason these stories remain less familiar than those of Jamaica or Haiti is because the Dutch Caribbean is made up of smaller islands and territories, separated not only by geography but also by language. While English speaking Caribbean history is often shared across the region, the Dutch speaking Caribbean has sometimes remained outside those conversations, yet the people who lived there faced many of the same struggles and demonstrated the same determination to secure their freedom. Today, these acts of resistance are remembered through national holidays, museums, historical research, and the descendants who continue to preserve their ancestors' stories. They remind us that the fight against slavery was never confined to one colony or one empire. It was a shared Caribbean experience, with each island adding its own chapter to that history. Now, before we turn to the food, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the remarkable people we've met throughout this journey. They came from different islands, spoke different languages, and resisted in different ways, yet they shared one belief that united them across the Dutch Caribbean. Freedom was always worth fighting for. The history of the Dutch Caribbean is reflected not only in its people, but also in its food. Across the region, African culinary traditions blended with indigenous ingredients, European influences, and local crops to create cuisines that remain central to island life today. Many of the dishes eaten throughout the Dutch Caribbean tell stories of survival, adaptation, and community. Ingredients that once sustained enslaved people and maroon communities are now celebrated as part of each island's cultural identity. Like the history we've explored today, every island has its own story to tell. In Suriname, dishes such as heri heri, moxieleshi, and peanut soup with tom tom preserve traditions that can be traced back to West and Central Africa. Curacao is known for hearty stews, funchi, and saltfish dishes that reflect centuries of cultural exchange. Aruba and Bonaire share many of these traditions while adding their own local ingredients and cooking techniques. Food became another way of preserving identity when so much else was under threat. Recipes were passed from one generation to the next, carrying memories of home, family, and culture long after people had been separated from their ancestral lands. The stories of resistance we've explored today remind us that freedom was never simply about breaking physical chains. It was also about preserving language, traditions, beliefs, and the everyday practices that make people who they are. Food became one of the most enduring expressions of that resilience. Let's take a look at a few dishes that continue to tell those stories today. But before we get into the food, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's episode, Global Kitchen Travels. If today's story has inspired you to explore the cuisine of the Dutch Caribbean and beyond, you'll find authentic recipes and food history, plus over 1,000 recipes from around the world at globalkitchentravels.com. Now, let's talk about the food. Since I already told you about some of the delicious Afro-Surinamese recipes in a previous episode, Season 2, Episode 7, Keti Koti and the Maroons of Suriname, today we're going to focus on some of the delicious recipes in the rest of the Dutch Caribbean. Geshiena. This dish has evolved into a scrumptious meat and cheese pie that serves as the national dish of both Aruba and Curaçao. Bunchi Corastoba, hearty stews of beans and meat, is common of the African descended stews of the Caribbean. This one, with a combination of meats and beans, is the perfect home-style food of the Dutch Caribbean. It can include any variety of chicken, beef, or goat meat, and also commonly includes salt meat for additional depth of flavors. Panlevi. This recipe represents a different history of the Dutch Caribbean, with Curaçao being home to the oldest synagogue in the Americas. Panlevi are egg-rich cookies that come from the Sephardic Jewish community, but have become a breakfast staple or snack with all of the ethnic communities of the Dutch Caribbean. Funchi. This stiff cornmeal porridge comes from the indigenous people of the region. However, it is also very similar to the African-inspired swallows, fufu, of the region. In Aruba, funchi is more common than rice. It is eaten with stews and soups, and alongside geshiena, it can also be made into a delicious snack when cut into thick slices and fried, topped with cheese. Bambati. Traditionally made from leftover funchi, these cornmeal pancakes, translated literally as smash bread, is another common side dish instead of rice. While you can definitely enjoy them with syrup and butter as you would do pancakes, it is just as commonly enjoyed as a flatbread with stews or curry. Every culture in the world has some form of a meat patty or handheld pie, and the Dutch Caribbean is no exception. Pastiche fillings can include things like chicken, beef, or saltfish, very similar to other Caribbean meat patties. However, we have a few more popular fillings that aren't so common in other Caribbean countries, like tuna fish or cheese, specifically Dutch cheese like Edam or Gouda. Now, why is this history so important? From Boni's raids launched out of Fort Boko to Coffij's vision of a self-governed Berbice, to Tula standing in a field on Curaçao and asking why liberty applied to everyone except him. What strikes me most about the Dutch Caribbean's history is how much of it has been left out of the story we're usually told about Caribbean resistance. We hear about Haiti, we hear about Jamaica, we rarely hear about Thico on Aruba, or Martis de Catalina Janga organizing Bonaire salt workers, or the 14 people on Ceiba who seized the vessel with nothing but the hope of reaching Puerto Rico. And that's exactly why the food matters here. When you make a pot of bunchi corastoba or stufa quechillena, the way enslaved cooks first improvised it out of a discarded cheese rind, you're not just cooking dinner, you're keeping alive the same instinct that drove Boni into the rainforest and Tula into that field. The refusal to let someone else decide what you're allowed to have, to be, or to remember. That's the through line of everything we've covered today. Resistance didn't end when a rebellion was crushed or a leader was executed. It just changed shape into a recipe passed down, a name still spoken, a dish still on the table generations later. Every time one of these foods gets made in a kitchen today, on any of these islands or in the diaspora far beyond them, that's resistance still happening. So cook one of these dishes this week. Tell someone why it matters. That's how these stories stay alive. Thanks for listening today. Remember, recipes are more than instructions. They're stories shaped by history, culture, and people. You'll find the full article, recipes, and resources in the show notes. I'm Chef Mireille, and I'll meet you in the next episode.